September 2007. After living in Southern California for 30 years, I was finally moving to the East Coast. I wanted to be around old oak and hickory trees, see centuries-old brick homes whose past residents now occupy the history books. Philadelphia has plenty of colonial and Victorian buildings that are rich in history, such as the Independence Hall and the home of Edgar Allan Poe. However, the building that I will always think of first is a house of sorrow. After 3 days of traveling by rail from California through Chicago to Philadelphia plus a 6-hour delay, I was really exhausted by the time I arrived at Union Station. Too exhausted for a formal greeting with my sister and her family that came to pick me up. I will be living with them for a while, so the meet and greet can hold after I make up for 3 days of lost sleep. 20 minutes later we arrived at the residence in North Philly around Kensington and Allegheny Street. It was a row home, one of many that line up shoulder to shoulder. These row homes were built a century ago during the Industrial Revolution for factory workers. Ours was no different from the others. It was a crumbling 2-story brick house with a basement. Well, more of a house on top of a house, since each level has its own kitchen and bath. I staked claim to the couch on the first level, where I would stay for the next several months. My first few nights there were uneventful. Maybe it was because I was still exhausted from my travel to notice anything out of the ordinary, or perhaps nothing happened at all. About 2 weeks in, I began to notice scratching noises. I asked my brother-in-law if he notices it. He said yes, and that is because the abandoned house next door is full of stray cats. Ah, cats. Who can be upset at those furry felines that bring us joy? Satisfied with the explanation, I ignored the scratching that goes on at night. I got a job working evenings until 2 a.m. at Center City, the heart of Philadelphia. By the time I got home it was almost 3 a.m. No howling wind in the cold autumn nights or the sound of cats scratching was going to disturb my sleep. My body needs rest, and so it must, but my sixth sense is ever vigilant. There were times when my mind told me to wake up, be alert, be on guard because something sinister is near. But I would ignore it. One night, that feeling of dread was so strong it woke me up. When I opened my eyes, I saw my sister standing in a slouch pose right next to me, just staring down on me. I looked into her eyes, peered into her soul. There was nothing there. She was just an empty husk, no different from a marionette whose strings were being handled by something without a body. This was a paranormal experience I was going through. I knew it because I had the exact same feeling when I was 6 years old, when a thick black cloud without form visited me in the bathroom. I sat up to show her I was awoke and aware, but I did not say a word to her. She kept staring at me. I stared back at her. After a long 2 minutes or so, the stalemate was broken. She walked away, walked down to the basement without turning the light on. Then the scratching noise began. I wanted to see how this was going to play out, but ended up falling asleep. I did not see my sister later that morning or the rest of the day. Later in the mid-afternoon, my brother-in-law came home with the kids. I told him what happened that night and asked if he knew anything. He seemed uncomfortable and ignored my inquiry, which led me to believe that he knew more than what he was letting on. 2 nights passed without any incident. On the third night, it happened again. My sister came downstairs, stood over me and just stared. This time I did not get up. I lay there, pretending to be asleep to see what happens next. After a while she walked down to the basement and the scratching followed. 4 o'clock came but she did not return from the basement. 5 o'clock rolled by and still no sign of her. By 6 o'clock I fell asleep, unable to complete the investigation. The following night, something different happened. Rather than watching me then going to scratch the walls in the basement, she opened the front door and walked out into the twilight. It was strange, to say the least. Other than the local 7-Eleven and a few Chinese food places, there were no places to go at that hour, not to mention the dangers of a gang-infested neighborhood. Around 10 o'clock in the morning she returned home. She appeared to be her normal self again. I asked her where had she gone all of that time. She would not say. She bumped me aside with her shoulder, went upstairs, and locked herself in her bedroom. This was not a sleepwalking case. Sleepwalkers usually perform tasks they are used to doing, such as taking out the trash, and rarely does it go on beyond a few minutes. What is more perplexing is that no one wants to talk about it, not my sister, her husband, or her kids. The subject was taboo. I wanted to help my sister, help her whole family, but the veil of secrecy had stalled me. We had an older sister who lived in South Philly. We would go visit her twice a month on the weekends. There were 3 things most Cambodian American families do on the weekends: eat hot pot, drink medicinal alcohol, and sing karaoke. A day at my sister's house in South Philly always meant a good time. The sister whom I lived with always act goofy when she is drunk before falling asleep. One day, we saw a different drunk. My sister moaned and cried rather than follow the happy drunk routine. Everyone tried to console her, but to no effect. Eventually, she cried herself to sleep. Her husband put her in the car and we went home. Things got weird on the way home. More signs of possession manifested. My sister began speaking gibberish. Her son cried out, "Mom," as he shook her to snap out of it. It did not work. It got worse. Her voice became louder, her tone became angrier. Her husband told her to wake up but made no progress in bringing her back to her senses. At this point, everyone in the car was freaked out. The secrecy of her affliction can no longer be contained. This continued on even when we got home. Her husband took her and the kids upstairs and I did not see them for the rest of the evening. The following day my brother-in-law came to talk to me about what has been going on. He did not want to unravel the truth earlier because he was afraid that it would anger whatever spirit was in control of my sister. He said he noticed her strange behavior when she began working her current job at a convalescent home where old folks abandoned by their families go to die. However, according to her husband, her job site is not the source of her haunting. He suspected it was an abandoned house 2 blocks away from the convalescent home. He went on to elaborate. He said he followed her to work when the strange behavior began. Her shift starts at 10 p.m. and ends at 8 a.m. the following morning. Yet she leaves the house for work around 6 p.m. The bus ride to work is about 35 minutes, which leaves about 3.5 hours unaccounted for. That 3 hours in the evening were being spent inside the abandoned house, he claimed. When he spied on her, he saw my sister singing and dancing inside the dilapidated house for hours, even going down to the basement to do only God knows what. I believed that he was onto something. However, the truth will not be fully unraveled until I discover the history of that house. I began my investigation by going to see that house in person. It was in the outlying area northwest of the city. The area had an abundance of old-growth trees. There were oaks, beeches, willows, and even some cherry trees. There were a few Victorian-era houses, but the majority of the homes there were turn-of-the-century and mid-century brick homes. Each house has its own lot, not like the cramped row homes where I lived. The house in question was a mid-century home. It was medium-size, two-story with a triangular roof. The long grass, uncut brushes around the property and graying brick adds to the creepiness of the house. Following the broken driveway leads to an attached garage. Above the garage is a room that was partially burned. I suspected that fire probably had something to do with whatever tragedy that happened here. The following week I went to City Hall to continue my research. I found that the person who purchased the house in 1957 still owned that house 50 years later. Now that I had a name, I went to the library to research what happened by going through old newspapers on microfiche. It did not take long to find the article I was searching for. The headline read, "Mother Dies Attempting to Rescue Beloved Son from Fire." It was dated 1962. The article stated that the son was nursing a broken leg when a fire broke out in his room. The mother attempted to save him, but both ended up consumed by fire before fire rescue arrived. The father was away on a business trip when the tragedy occurred. Some say that traumatic events leave imprints long after they occurred. These imprints are tied to the spirits that are unable to move on. And sometimes these spirits would attach themselves to the living in an attempt to have the life taken from them. That is the nature of ghost possession. I shared the information I found with my brother-in-law and I recommended a traditional Cambodian exorcism, not that garlic and rosary nonsense that failed even in the movies. To which he agreed. We sent my sister to Long Beach where a famous Cambodian priest lived. The exorcism was performed over several days. After it was completed, we noticed the change in her. The nightly walks became less frequent, the scratching on the walls went away, and eventually the ghost that had possessed my sister lost its grip on her. But did it move on, or did it return to that old house waiting for another victim?